digitally though to the Eastern Europe Studies Center for a very interesting event. I'm more than sure of that. My name is Konstantinas Andrijauskas, and I am an associate expert at the Center's China program, and it is my pleasure to moderate a discussion today, which is on the geopolitics of semiconductors. And we have two very distinguished speakers representing the theoretical and practical fields. And the first speaker for us today would be Christopher Miller, who happens to be an associate professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He is also a Jean Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and also he is Eurasia Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And besides those credentials, he is the author of the bestseller, which is titled Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technologies. So we're very much glad to have you here today. And from the Lithuanian side, more of a practitioner and policymaking side, we do have another distinguished guest, the Minister of Economy and Innovation of the Republic of Lithuania, Aušrinė. So I believe that considering that our discussion today is titled Geopolitics of Semiconductors, it would be rather apt to start from Christos, if I may, comments on, well, basically the title of our meeting today, and also the title of your book by extension. So why are semiconductors, or chips for that matter, so important and so critical for today, and how do we understand their importance and significance in geopolitical manifestations in today's international relations and international politics? So I would strongly encourage the auditorium to post their questions at the Zoom platform to the Q&A session, and the initial idea is for our presenters to dedicate some 10 to 12 minutes for the initial remarks, thus leaving some half an hour for the Q&A session. And with that, up to you, Chris. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction to join this conversation today on a very important topic for relations between Europe, the United States, and also partners and allies in Asia. The past couple of years have illustrated via the shortages of semiconductors, just the criticality of chips to the modern economy, whether it's consumer devices like smartphones or PCs, whether it's household goods like refrigerators or dishwashers, or whether it's the infrastructure that powers the economy like data centers or telecoms infrastructure. Chips are critical for all aspects of modern life. But in addition to their importance to the civilian economy, they're also critical for military systems. And what you find if you look at what defense ministries around the world are buying today in terms of military equipment, or are thinking about developing over the coming decade or two, they're envisioning defense systems and intelligence systems that are more reliant than ever before on advanced computing, communications, and sensing technologies. And that means they'll require a whole lot of semiconductors. It's already the case that even fairly old military systems like Javelin anti-tank missiles have 200 semiconductors inside, but newer systems have even more chips with even more advanced requirements and capabilities. And that makes ensuring access to chips and ensuring our advantages in semiconductors not only an issue that's relevant for economic reasons, but also an issue that's fundamentally important for the geopolitical balance and our military power. Today, the process of making advanced chips requires inputs from multiple different countries, from Europe to the United States to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And in particular, the role of Taiwan is worth noting because Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips and over 1/3 of the new computing power the world adds each year. So its centrality in the chip industry really can't be underestimated. And that's why the security of Taiwan is That's one of the reasons why the security of Taiwan is absolutely critical, not just for Taiwan or for the United States, which has pledged to defend Taiwan for many decades, but also for the rest of the world. And I think over the past several years, the world has woken up to the extent to which the PRC is increasingly threatening Taiwan's autonomy, as well as the extent to which new Chinese capabilities, military capabilities that in many cases leverage advanced computing technologies, are being used to pressure and to bully Taiwan. If you talk to economy ministries or defense ministries around the world, in Japan, in Europe, in the US, and Korea, or in Taiwan, what you'll find is a growing recognition that semiconductors are fundamentally important. But that recognition is just the first step to building a sensible semiconductor policy, because the next step is facilitating collaboration between the key countries involved. And this is where we've taken some important steps collectively over the past several years, where there's a lot more work, in my view, to be done. The first step is to understand the different ways in which certain countries play major roles in the semiconductor supply chain. And one of the things that you find as you dig into the process of making advanced semiconductors is that many companies and countries have really unique roles and capabilities that are often only replicated by a couple of other companies, and in some cases by none. For example, if you want to acquire the ultra precise machine tools that are needed to manufacture semiconductors, there are just a couple of companies in the world that can produce these machine tools. ASML, for example, in the Netherlands, or Applied Materials in California, have really pretty unique capabilities that unless you can access their tools, you simply can't make advanced chips. And if you try to understand how those companies make their machines and dig into their supply chains, what you find as well is a very complex set of component suppliers stretching across Europe, the US, and Japan, that produces the precision machining necessary to fabricate advanced chips. So there's a bunch of choke points in the process of making semiconductors and the machine tools that are required to manufacture them, which thankfully are almost exclusively in the hands of partner countries, whether in the US, in Europe, or in Japan. And so the West in aggregate has a really critical amount of power over the machine tools that are needed to make chips. And these machine tools are very, very difficult for other countries to replicate, practically impossible over the short run, maybe possible for China over a longer run. But the machines involved are capable of moving materials at the nanometer scale, billionths of a meter. They involve hundreds of thousands of component parts and some real engineering challenges. Some of the flattest mirrors, for example, ever made, ultra powerful lasers, some really unique capabilities that have only been developed for the chip industry and therefore are very hard for other countries and other companies to copy. In addition to the machine tools that are needed to make chips, you also need really advanced software capabilities. And the software tools that are necessary to design advanced chips are also monopolized by a couple of countries. The key software tools to design chips are produced by 3 US-based firms, one of which is in turn owned by Siemens of Germany. And so here too, the West has a really strong hold over the tools needed to make chips. Without these tools, it's basically impossible to design an advanced chip, because an advanced semiconductor today could have 10 or 20 billion components on it. And so designing a chip with so many components is basically impossible without these very specific software tools. So this is another sphere like the machine tools in which the West has monopoly over some of the key components that go into chips. If you look also at the materials involved in chip making, you find that there are a number of places where Western and Japanese firms have, again, unique capabilities. Some of the chemicals, for example, needed to manufacture chips are places where Western firms have really substantial market share, and competitors have products that are not really comparable, especially at the cutting edge. And so there as well, there's choke points that are in the hands of Western firms that have been taken advantage of. And these choke points matter for 2 reasons. The first is that right now, the Chinese government is pouring tens of billions of dollars a year, and has been for the past decade, into its own chip industry, and in a way that is profoundly distorting the functioning of the world semiconductor market, and is intended to bolster China's chip making capabilities so that China can become more independent in semiconductor production and deploy these capabilities to defense and military systems. Today, China is really quite far behind when it comes to making chips. China, as a result of this, spends more money each year importing chips than it spends importing oil, which is a signal of its dependence on imported chips from Taiwan, from Korea, from Japan, and elsewhere. But it's trying hard to rectify its backwardness in chip making and spending lots of money and subsidies to do so. And this is threatening the profitability of firms in market economies in Europe and Japan and Taiwan and the US and elsewhere. So this is the first challenge that the chip industry faces, is massive Chinese subsidies that are distorting the market. The second challenge the chip industry faces is that China is trying to use technology, not only its own domestically developed technology, but also technology purchased from the US and Taiwan and Japan and Europe to deploy it to military systems. And what we found over the past decade is, despite regulations that in theory make it illegal for China to take chips made in Taiwan or the US or elsewhere and put them in military systems, in fact, there's lots of open source evidence of ways that the Chinese military has been able to access advanced semiconductors, including the types of chips that are needed to train artificial intelligence systems, which China is betting on as part of its military modernization program. And so last year, the US announced new restrictions on the transfer of certain types of chips and chip making equipment to China, with the goal of restricting China's access to the chips that are needed to train artificial intelligence systems. And at stake here is not just the future of the chip industry, it's the future of computing power. Because today, if you want to train an AI system, whether it's ChatGPT or whether it's an advanced military system, you need access to ultra advanced chips that are uniquely capable of training AI in advanced data centers. Until last year, these chips were legal to transfer to China. Now they are illegal to transfer to China. And thanks to a trilateral agreement between the US, Japan, and the Netherlands, it's also now illegal to transfer certain tools that are needed to manufacture these chips to China. And so the goal is to restrain China's ability to develop AI systems that can be deployed to military and intelligence uses. The US and its allies are trying to hold back China's advances in computing power on the assumption that any advances in computing that China is capable of acquiring will be deployed to intelligence uses and to defense uses. And the history suggests, and I'll wrap up here, the history of the last 75 years suggests that whenever a country has access to advanced computing capabilities, it always deploys them to the defense and intelligence uses, whether it's the first British computers during World War II that were cracking Nazi codes, or the US supercomputers during the Cold War that tracked Soviet submarines, or the supercomputers that both the Soviet KGB and the United States National Security Agency had privileged access to for use in signals intelligence. It's inevitable that great powers will deploy their most advanced computing capabilities for strategic aims. And if China is able to make progress in catching up in computing by making progress in catching up in chips, this will inevitably have an impact on the geopolitical balance and also therefore on Taiwan's security. And so the chip industry is shifting today under the pressure of regulations from the US and Japan and Europe and Taiwan, which are not only about commercial issues, although China's subsidies are a major issue, but they're also fundamentally about military power and about security in East Asia and in the Taiwan Straits in particular, because the military balance over the past 2 decades has swung in China's favor relative to both Taiwan and the United States. And now the US and its allies are betting that by restricting China's access to the chips that make AI possible, it'll be able to limit China's advances in military and intelligence uses of AI and slow the growth of Chinese military potential. So I'll wrap up my remarks there, but I'm looking forward to hearing the minister's comments and any questions after that.
Thank you, Christopher. A fascinating account indeed that very well reveals the importance of the industry for our postmodern system and the basic necessities of life. Particularly like the fact that you said, this is quite novel for many people who would, hear of this for the first time, that China is spending more in terms of importing chips than it spends on importing oil, which is something remarkable considering that it's the world's largest natural resource consumer, quite obviously. And there is also this metaphor that quite often tells us that the chips they happen to be the oil of the 21st century. So speaking of this oil, what is the Lithuanian role in this? Does Lithuania understand the importance of the chips? What are the latest developments in this particular regard? And what is the Taiwanese factor in this particular story? This is something that I would like to ask the practitioner, the representative of the Lithuanian government, Minister of Economy and Innovation, Aušrinė. Please, your thoughts on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Chris, for a very comprehensive input. I am a fan, actually, reading your book currently. Coming perhaps from China, the US, and all these global issues, coming to Lithuanian case, maybe just a few remarks and thoughts. So Lithuania is a small country, 3 million population in the European Union. We do not have any natural resources like gold or minerals or something like that. We have to build our economy on knowledge and on technologies. And this is the key fundamental thing. We are basically, base our priorities and our strategies. We do have 3 priority industries. We already have some success stories. It's biotechnology, engineering, and also information communication technologies. And when you look at these industries, obviously the number one thing is you need is talent, and the other is of course these components, chips that are everywhere in your computers, phones, smartwatches, everywhere, especially with the heavy investment that is coming into e-vehicles and also energy innovation. This is something that will be, and it already is, as it was very well said, an oil or gold of the 21st century. So when it comes to the Lithuanian case, it was quite a logical thing for us to do, considering our priorities and planning the future of our economy, is that we have to put more attention into partnerships and into our own domestic capacities, what we are doing here, and how we are meeting our own demands, our own demand within our economy. 20% of our GDP comes from manufacturing industry. And when we talk to our companies, their top priority is, their own demands. So basically why we are, sort of putting more political attention and more investment into the semiconductor industry is, of course, our own domestic demand. Now, a few more things, perhaps on the geopolitical thing and also on the partnership with Taiwan. We have listened to Chris' introduction, and there was no Europe basically in it. And I don't think it is a coincidence, Europe is lagging behind a bit when it comes to innovation, chip industry. Well, yes, so we have companies that do participate in value chains and are quite significant. The one that was mentioned, Dutch company SML, and others. But again, we are lagging behind, and we have to build and strengthen our own domestic capacities within the European Union, and that's why the European Commission proposed a so-called European Chip Act. What Lithuania is interested regarding European Chip Act is not is to participate and to have a possibility as a smaller country with a smaller companies, to participate in these value chains, not to, leave all the resources and capacities to the biggest players, but to diversify. And we want to be a part of that diversification. So first, as I said, we want to meet our own demand, our own manufacturing demand. And second, we want to be a part of that diversification and strengthening European domestic capacities when it comes to both manufacturing and also, software development even, and designing and so on. Now, partnership with Taiwan is something that is a bit different when it comes to Lithuanian case, because we have an agreement with our Taiwanese partners and friends to, have their technology transferred to one of Lithuanian companies, Teltonika. And this is extremely unusual because, well, of the whole silicon shield and chip manufacturing and chip designing is something that, of course, is significant in, a part of even national security, perhaps, in Taiwan. But they have agreed to share this technology with us, and they have said publicly that they are not going to do it with any other country. So we truly appreciate that. We do believe that this partnership will sort of make it will help us grow our semiconductor capacities faster. I'm sure that the chip industry in Lithuania would have happened with or without Taiwanese partnership, but with this friendship, with these kind of agreement, with this technology transfer, we'll be able to make it faster, and probably, well, Teltonika's project, it is quite a significant, and I'm pretty sure, that it will play a huge and significant part to our GDP in the years to come. Maybe one more tiny thing, but quite important, on the machine tools, that are being used in the chip industry. Not many knows that Lithuania is quite famous for its laser technology and short pulse lasers, femtosecond lasers in particular. So this means that your smartphone's camera could have been cut by a Lithuanian laser, because they are being used both in the manufacturing industry and also universities all around the world. Fun fact that ASML uses a little bit of Lithuanian equipment when it comes to machine tools that are being used in chip manufacturing. So we are already there. We are already, our companies are already in the value chain with manufacturing chips, but we want to build our own capacities as well, meeting our own manufacturing demand, being a part of a European's agenda when it comes to diversification and growing domestic capacities, and building partnerships with like-minded countries, because this whole geopolitical element is essential. We are we are a country that still experiences Chinese coercion activities regarding our exports. And, we have never chosen to sort of have these kind of economic consequences when it comes to really our relationship with China. But it does show that, okay, partnering with maybe unfriendly countries, let's put it this way, may not be secured when it comes to your economic relationship. It's not that stable, and Lithuania is an example in this.
Thank you very much, Minister. So these were the initial remarks. I thank both of you for staying within the limits of time. And at this point, I would kindly ask those people who are watching us on Facebook if they would have any questions, if there is only such possibility for you. So please enter the Zoom and post your questions in the Q&A for the Zoom session. And we already do have one question, and let me phrase that one. The question is posed by a colleague of mine, Professor Tomas Janeliūnas, and a question is directed to Christopher. Chris, could you please elaborate on the deal of the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands regarding restriction to export shipbuilding instruments machinery to China? May it efficiently hinder China from developing its own chip industry in the nearest future? Or does it make a big influence and impact on China's efforts to become more sufficient in terms of chip building? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. If you look at the types of machine tools that are restricted by the trilateral agreement, what you find is that it's only fairly advanced tools that are restricted. So the types of machines you need to make less advanced chips are untouched by the restrictions. So China will still be able to straightforwardly make many types of chips. But when it comes to advanced processor and memory chips, it will struggle to access the tools that it needs. And because these tools are made by just a very small number of companies in just 3 countries, the Netherlands, Japan, and the United States. And because there's really no competitors in China that are close to the cutting edge technologically, it's going to be difficult for China to make forward progress in the next couple of years. At some point, I'm sure China will find ways to domestically produce these machines, but it's going to take some time, at least years and perhaps a decade, to replicate the types of machines that are currently produced just in these 3 countries. And what's critical to remember is that in a decade's time, the cutting edge will be far ahead, because the key dynamic in the chip industry is Moore's law, which has predicted correctly over the past 60 years that the amount of computing power on each chip doubles every year or 2. And so what that means is that over a decade's time, you get 5 doublings of computing power, an extraordinary exponential increase. And so, the question to ask in terms of China's capabilities is not really in 10 years, will China catch up to 2023 levels of technology? I think the answer to that is probably yes. But in 2033, in 10 years' time, the cutting edge is going to be 5 Moore's laws ahead of today. And so even if China catches up to the current cutting edge in 10 years' time, the rest of us will be far, far ahead in terms of the types of chips we can produce. So the real question is, can China catch up to the cutting edge in 10 years' time? And that's going to be very, very difficult to do, just because the cutting edge is moving ahead so rapidly. And China is starting out from a position of being at minimum multiple generations behind. And in certain segments of the supply chain, like the machine tools, China's over 5 generations behind. So it's just a really difficult process of catching up, which is why the trend in the industry over the past decade has not been of catching up, of companies falling behind. And the leading companies have had fewer competitors in recent years because it's been so hard to compete at the cutting edge.
Super, great, thank you. Minister Armonaitė, I believe, mentioned silicon shield, which happens to be a very important concept in terms of understanding the defense of Taiwan. The concept has to do with this matter that the Taiwanese would believe that the sheer fact that they happen to be such an important hub for the most advanced chip manufacturing, that it kind of makes them more secure. And Chris, judging from your book, it seems to be that particularly the final part, the conclusion, the last chapter, I believe, you seem to be rather skeptical about that, that you apparently have quite a lot of room for caution in this regard. And an extra question related to that is to Minister Armonaitė. Would you think that if that indeed succeeds, and this is obviously something that all of us hope, if indeed Lithuania succeeds in becoming an important part of the global semiconductor construction and production chain, would you think that it would increase our security or decrease our security, considering the very unfriendly neighborhood that we are having, and the wars that are being waged very much nearby. Thank you. Please let us start with you, Chris, maybe.
Well, I think certainly Taiwanese leaders believe in the concept of the Silicon Shield. The idea being that Taiwan's critical role in the chip industry means that if China were to blockade or to attack, it would disrupt Taiwan's chip exports and impact the whole world, including China. There's no doubt that if China were to disrupt Taiwan's ability to export chips, the economic impact on China would be dramatic. Because China spends as much money importing chips as oil, it needs those chips for its economy, for its electronics assembly, for its machinery. However, I think history provides many examples of countries that start wars despite the fact that wars aren't in their economic interest. I think that the experience of last year with Russia's attack on Ukraine is just the most recent example of a war that was not deterred by economic interconnection. I think if you look at Angela Merkel's energy policy over the last decade, you'll find a policy based on the thesis that more energy interdependence would produce peace, and that was proven to be, hopelessly false last year. And so I don't think we should put too much faith in the idea that economic interdependence necessarily guarantees peace, because most wars that start not because the leaders in question think they're economically beneficial, but because they think they're politically or strategically or militarily beneficial. I think in addition to that, there's a second concern I have, which is China's leaders understand that if they launch a full attack on Taiwan, they're likely to trigger a US response. And so the smart strategy from China's perspective, and I think China's leaders are generally pretty smart, is to try to start an escalation below the threshold of what might trigger an immediate US response. And there's a number of ways you can do that. For example, starting a blockade or seizing one of the offshore islands would be very difficult for the US to respond to, because a blockade could be implemented without any shooting potentially. And if China were to implement a blockade without firing a shot and challenge the US to shoot first, it would be very difficult for the US president to respond. Not impossible, but difficult. And in that type of scenario, a partial blockade, the US leadership would face a choice. You can either do nothing, let the Chinese blockade persist, which would dramatically undermine US credibility around the world and really threaten the security and autonomy of Taiwan, or you could do something to press the Chinese to lift the blockade, either militarily or some sort of economic pressure campaign. But anything you did to try to lift the blockade would threaten the supply chains that crisscross the Taiwan Straits, and thereby risk imposing a massive cost on the world economy. And I think in that scenario, I think China's leaders could well believe that in a context of a blockade, where China imposed the blockade without firing a shot, and then turned to the US and said, all right, Washington, your move, the fact that any US response would have major economic ramifications for the whole world, precisely because of Taiwan's centrality in semiconductor supply chains, that could end up deterring the US president from acting rather than deterring the Chinese from acting. In other words, I think that the criticality of Taiwan to international supply chains and chip making might not be nearly as good a guarantee of security as many Taiwanese leaders think. And I worry about putting too much faith in the Silicon Shield thesis, both for that reason and because just last year we saw another example of a dictator start a war that was not in his economic interests, but he thought was in his strategic interests. So I'm quite skeptical of the Silicon Shield thesis. And I think we should rely, rather than on the Silicon Shield, on more conventional military deterrence, both for Taiwan and also for the United States, both countries of which I think have been underinvesting in conventional deterrence, despite the fact that Chinese capabilities have been growing.
Thank you. Great. Minister Armonaitė, what about the applicability of this thesis to Lithuania? Thank you.
Well, my sort of My point is very simple. Growing the capacities, of course, would make you stronger. I don't, let's just understand that Lithuania just started, strategically investing into the sort of industry. So it's not that we are a global player in the industry yet. So let's just, consider it, the situation as it is, and growing the domestic capacities, either or of designing or manufacturing or any other new technology like, I don't know, silicon carbide, right? So this just, these technologies makes your economy stronger. And that's how I see it, If it is stronger, then we do have more sort of technology to build our own domestic defense technologies and so on and so forth. So, I'm an optimist. I'm sure it will make us stronger.
That is a very fair point indeed. Christopher, you've mentioned Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion to Ukraine, which obviously is an issue of utmost importance and concern to us. Just this morning, early morning in the US, right, we were able to listen to Mr. Putin's latest speech. Nothing apparently that much new, but it is rather apparent if you would read between the lines that he's preparing for the long war. Could you please tell us how chips happen to be important in Russia's war effort on the battlefield? Because for quite a lot of Lithuanians, that would probably be a very interesting story to tell that, would allow to further reveal the importance of chips, not only for civilian industry and creation of postmodern economy, but on the battlefield as well, which is yet again quite a big concern for us. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question and an important topic. I think if you look at Russia's domestic chip industry, what you find is a chip industry that is very backwards technologically in many ways, far, far behind the cutting edge of what can be produced, for example, in Taiwan, far, far behind of the non-cutting edge chips that can be produced in China. Russia's most advanced logic chip making, the latest reports that I've seen is that the best chips that can be made are in the 65 nanometer node, which is 10 generations or so behind the cutting edge, just really far behind. And the volumes that Russia can produce are small. The chip making facilities in Russia are very limited. And I suspect, although it's very difficult to get any hard data on this, that since the war began and Western exports in the chip making segment to Russia were severely restricted, that Russia's volumes of chips produced are substantially down relative to what they were before the war. So Russia doesn't really have much of a domestic chip making industry. It's got a very small one that's not at all advanced. But for military systems, Russia's relied in recent years on importing chips from abroad. And it's imported chips from Europe, from the United States, from Japan, from Korea, sometimes legally buying chips because certain chips weren't sanctioned or controlled before last February and March, but also illegally buying chips by smuggling them in via third parties. And it's been doing this because chips are absolutely critical to military systems. Military systems have often hundreds, or in some cases thousands of semiconductors inside. Some of these semiconductors are very simple microcontrollers that can be purchased very easily online. Others are quite sophisticated. Any sort of radar system, for example, requires quite sophisticated chips. Many types of sensors require chips inside of them. Communications capabilities require unique types of semiconductors as well. And so, although it's hard to get concrete data given the secrecy in Russia's system, it's likely the case that the Russian defense industrial base has faced pretty significant supply chain issues in terms of its ability to acquire chips over the past year, given the intensification of sanctions by Europe, the US, and by other countries. Now we've seen Chinese exports of chips to Russia increase markedly. in response. So China's trying to sell more chips to Russia, and Russia's trying to buy more from China. This is certainly helping Russia, but there are certain types of chips that China doesn't produce. And so for these types, Russia must try to smuggle them in somehow, whether from Kazakhstan or from Turkey, both of which have seen chip sales to Russia increase, or via other means. And there's been some media reports recently of smuggling networks, both in the US and in Europe, that have been deployed by Russia to acquire certain types of chips. So it's definitely a challenge for Russia to acquire the chips that it needs. Certainly military systems of all types require many different categories of semiconductor. But we've also seen Russia adapt by buying more from China, by working with counterparties in Turkey and elsewhere, and by activating smuggling networks to acquire some of the chips that it needs for its military.
Great. Thank you, Chris. We've got a question from auditorium to the minister, and it is from anonymous attendee. And he or she asks, what should be done from the side of the Lithuanian government to support and sustain the strategic investment into semiconductor industry for a decade to come, even despite a potential change of ruling political parties? So how to ensure that sustainability throughout the political changes, possible political changes when it comes to the government? Is there a national consensus on the matter, if I may add from myself as well? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, is talent. It's absolutely essential. And, investing into our universities, but also schools, curricula, I believe, and I hope this is a consensus, and all of the political parties sort of agree to some extent that education is a top priority, and especially regarding building our chip industry here in Lithuania. So this is a number one thing. I do not believe that public investment or any other investment or finances is a problem, because there are different kind of tools, financial instruments, subsidy mechanisms, both coming from the state aid schemes, but also venture capital and traditional banking systems. We understand that everything is getting slower a bit globally, but funding is not a problem anymore. I don't believe that we'll have any problem in this regard. Now, also, of course, I truly believe in our partnership with our Taiwanese colleagues and friends, and it is too early to tell whether it is a consensus in Lithuania. I must admit that we can't be sure of that. We'll see. But I believe that this partnership, not only because of chip industry of Lithuania, but also generally, both from the economic point of view and also from the liberal democracy point of view, this partnership has to be sort of secured and developed further on. So, and also perhaps the last point is the political attention, if I may say so. Sometimes it is important to bring your positions to Brussels, to be vocal about it internationally, also in the domestic European discussions when it comes to European strategies of Europe's industry in chip making. So this also needs leadership, and if we lose it somewhere, well, something will happen, of course, but we'll grow faster if we'll have a certain political leadership. What I am pretty sure is that Lithuanian companies will invest into industry no matter what. And well, I mean, we have mentioned Teltonika. They are putting at least €1 billion investment in their project. But we have more companies who are already, designing chips. They are smaller companies. We have laser companies that are growing rapidly. So chip industry is possible in Lithuania. We need talent, political leadership, and also, and also sort of belief. But because I know that, when you listen to a Lithuanian talking about chip industry in a 3 million country, sometimes people smile, but we'll prove that it is possible.
Hopefully so. Thank you, Minister. There is a more technical question by Aurimas Taurantas. Probably Chris would be well positioned to answer that, and I'll simply quote it. Sorry for my ignorance, says Aurimas, but it would be interesting to learn how it happens that the most advanced shipbuilding instruments are made by the companies in 3 mentioned countries, but chips themselves are made in Taiwan, not in those 3 countries. And the connected question is about transfer of technologies mentioned by the minister. Could it depend only on Taiwanese decision, or is it necessary to have the permission of the producers of those chip building instruments? Thank you in advance. So probably Chris, again, would be best positioned to answer these questions. But if the minister would have something to add, particularly to the second part of the question, that would also be great.
So the process of making machine tools needed to manufacture semiconductors is extraordinarily complex. There's lots of really unique engineering, chemistry, physics involved in each of the types of tools. So there are lithography tools that shine light to pattern chips. There are deposition tools that deposit thin films of materials, just a couple of atoms thick. There are etching tools that are able to etch small canyons into silicon, just a couple of atoms wide. And each of these tools is made via different processes, requires different types of engineering, and is produced by just 1 or 2 companies at the cutting edge level. But the companies that make these machines, although they're very good at making these machines, they don't make any chips, because making chips requires something very different. It requires using these machines plus specialized chemicals plus chip designs to actually manufacture chips. And because these processes are so complex, involving manufacturing billions of transistors per chip, and thousands or tens of thousands of chips per day, no single company can do all of it. You need to rely on dozens of companies across the supply chain. And so the machines that are made by the machine tool companies on their own, you can only make a chip if you know how to use these machines together with materials and chip design. So the machine tool makers specialize in making machine tools. They're very capable of doing that, but they know they don't have expertise in making chips. And so that's where TSMC in Taiwan and other chip makers have their expertise, is in bringing together the tools and the equipment and the materials and the designs. So they're really quite different businesses, deeply interlinked, but ultimately different skill sets that these companies have. And in terms of where these companies sell tools, they sell around the world where it's legal to do so. Now it's restricted in China and Russia for certain types of tools. But you can find these machines not only in Taiwan, but also in chip making facilities in Europe and the US and Japan and Korea as well.
Super. That was actually a very apt question, after all. Minister, would you have something to add? Mm-hmm.
The very quick note on the technology transfer part. So what I can, sort of reveal is that Lithuanian company has an agreement with an institution called ITRI. That's an Industrial Technology Research Institute of Taiwan. And this means that the company will be able to access licenses, patents, know-how, knowledge, training, and so on. Perhaps something more as well. So this makes us in a more advantageous position, because otherwise we would have to look for new for other partnerships and other sort of workarounds, if that's the proper language for that, because businesses are always, very sort of creative when it comes to, making their business plan work.
Great. Basically, so that means that the Taiwanese have enough of their own intellectual property, so to speak, to offer to Lithuania without being in need to ask anyone. And if they would be in need of asking the other involved actors, those gladly for us also happen to be our allies, or at least allied countries as well. There is an extra question to Christopher on industrial espionage, very apt. Are those few like-minded countries producing ultra-modern chips sufficiently well protected from quite predictable attempts by China or other countries having industrial ambitions to try to acquire those technologies through espionage? How efficient are the firewalls to protect Western industries from those malignant actors? Is there coordination between countries you mentioned, the US, Japan, Taiwan, the Netherlands, and other Europeans on those matters? Thank you. Very good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I would say two things about industrial espionage. The first is that on its own, industrial espionage is not enough. We've seen over the last decade numerous cases of attempted Chinese industrial espionage, some of which have worked, some of which haven't, but even the ones that have worked in terms of getting material out, information out, have not worked in terms of producing effective technology, because a lot of the capabilities involved are not primarily produced by computer files that can be copied and pasted, but by the knowledge of the engineers in question who have worked on these systems for many years or decades. And so, unlike some other industries, the chip industry is one in which simply copying and pasting files is not enough to build effective systems. It's certainly helpful, but it's far from enough on its own. What's more problematic is when engineers themselves leave one company and move to try to create a rival. And we've seen a number of instances recently, including with ASML, which recently announced in its annual report that a couple of former employees who were Chinese had tried to or succeeded in taking some data illegally and bringing it back to China to try to provide it to competitors. So there certainly is, there are instances underway of engineers leaving and trying illegally to start competitors with stolen information. And this certainly is a problem. We've seen over the past couple of years, a number of countries, including Taiwan, tighten the rules on when employees leave a chip maker, can they move to China? If so, how long do they have to wait? Under what restrictions? And I think these are important steps. I think there's probably more to be done in this sphere. The US, for example, has made it illegal for US persons, both citizens and permanent residents of the US, to work with certain Chinese chip firms that are close to the cutting edge. And although I think it's unlikely that Europe will take such a step, I think Europe should take such a step and make it illegal for Europeans as well to transfer expertise and knowledge to chip firms that are being sanctioned currently by Dutch export controls. Now, I'm cognizant of the fact that the EU makes decisions slowly, that it's not united on China issues, but I think the fact is that EU firms are all impacted by industrial espionage. And so all EU countries would benefit from a strengthened control regime that would limit the capacity of Chinese firms and the Chinese government to conduct industrial espionage, especially in a sphere like semiconductors, where we know China's been very active historically in this sphere in terms of trying to legally or illegally acquire knowledge from European firms.
Thank you, Christopher. Great point. The last question was posed by Ambassador Bartwolis. So thank you for that as well. We've got some 5 minutes to go. I do know that both of our interlocutors are very busy and have other meetings, but there is one last question, and it is more directed probably towards the minister. And the author of that question thanks for very interesting information and great perspectives. And the question is the following: considering that the latest softening by the People's Republic of China towards Lithuania and its companies. The attendee asks whether China's reaction to additional Taiwanese investments in Lithuania, including in semiconductor sphere, worsen the relationship with the country, or is the relationship improving despite of this? So are there any remarks on that the minister maybe would have? Was there any impact on the news about the Taiwanese investments in the industry for Sino-Lithuanian relations? That would probably be the key question.
Yeah, thank you. That's very clear. So no. And, it is an economic operation, and Taiwanese investments are all over the world. Germany, Czech Republic, any other country, as well as vice versa. There are offices of European Union members that are located in Taipei, working with trade. Just the similar office, Lithuania, has opened recently as well. So there is nothing new, and I do not understand why we should, sort of experience anything when it comes to economic relations with China, because there is nothing behind it. If we are developing economic cooperation with Taiwan as any other country either in the European Union or anywhere in the world. But of course, I understand the motivation of the question, because we have experienced the coercive measures before. So of course, you never know. And that is the main thing, when you are trading with, an illiberal regime, right? You can't be sure about your private property and the trade stability and so on. That's the problem. And that's why we need to, sort of grow our economic relationship with also more like-minded countries.
Thank you, Minister. With that positive note, considering that there's still quite a lot of like-minded countries across the world, and indeed they happen to be at the edge of technological capabilities, not only many other capabilities, as Chris very well argues in his book. I do thank you for this very interesting discussion. I thank you, the auditorium, as well. It was indeed very interesting. I do strongly expect that Lithuania would drive on these recent achievements, and that they would be at the beginning of something much, much, much bigger and much more sustainable, that would indeed bring us to the level of the world's most high-tech economies. And I thank you for your efforts in making that happen. And I obviously thank Christopher for his very insightful analysis, and I do strongly encourage the auditorium to buy and read his book. It is available on the web as well, on the Amazon. And thank you very much for being with us, and I wish you all of the best. Thank you for the auditorium as well.
Thank you.